On Christmas Eve in 1926, a man stumbled into Bellevue Hospital in New York City. He was hallucinating, clutching his stomach, and screaming that Santa Claus was chasing him with a knife. Within hours, he was dead. By the end of the holiday weekend, over 40 people in New York City alone had died in the exact same way. They were not killed by a mysterious plague. They were not poisoned by a foreign enemy or a serial killer. They were killed by the United States federal government. To enforce one single law, government chemists were ordered to deliberately mix lethal poisons, including wood alcohol, kerosene, gasoline, and mercury, into industrial alcohol, knowing full well that citizens would still drink it. By the time it was over, the government had poisoned and killed over 10,000 of its own citizens. And what was the magnificent goal of this deadly campaign? To stop Americans from drinking a beer. In 1920, the United States passed the 18th Amendment, banning the sale, production, and transportation of alcohol. It was supposed to be a noble experiment that would end crime, empty the prisons, and turn America into a moral paradise. Instead, that one single dumb law created the most powerful organized crime syndicate in human history, made street thugs into multi-millionaires, corrupted police forces nationwide, poisoned millions of people, and gave birth to the American Mafia. How on earth does a law designed to eliminate crime end up handing the entire country over to mobsters? To understand how one dumb law unleashed absolute chaos, we have to rewind to late 19th century America. Before Prohibition, America had a massive drinking problem. And that is not an exaggeration. By the late 1800s, the average American adult was drinking 3 times as much alcohol as we do today. In almost every town across the country, there was a saloon on every single corner. Saloons were not just bars. They were loud, chaotic hubs run by big brewing companies. Men would walk in after working a 12-hour factory shift, spend their entire weekly paycheck on whiskey, get into fistfights, and walk home broke, leaving their wives and children to starve. Unsurprisingly, a massive wave of public anger began to build. 2 powerful moral crusade groups emerged: the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League was arguably the most effective single-issue political lobbying machine in American history. They pressured politicians, published graphic pamphlets, and preached from church pulpits every Sunday, making one simple promise: if you ban alcohol, every single problem in society will vanish overnight. If we ban booze, poverty will disappear. Prisons will be closed because nobody will commit crimes anymore. Factory workers will be more productive, families will be happy, and America will become a heaven on earth. Wait, won't people just buy alcohol illegally if you ban it? Nonsense. Who would break a federal law just to have a drink? Spoiler alert, literally everyone. In 1919, the dry campaigners pulled off the impossible. They persuaded 3/4 of U.S. states to ratify the 18th Amendment, and Congress passed the Volstead Act to enforce it. At midnight on January 16, 1920, the United States officially went dry. Saloons closed their doors, breweries shut down their tanks, and moral crusaders celebrated in the streets, believing they had just saved human civilization. They really thought it was over. In reality, it was just beginning. Here's the fundamental economic mistake the US government made. They thought that by making alcohol illegal, they would eliminate the demand for alcohol. Demand did not go down at all. The day after Prohibition started, tens of millions of Americans still wanted a drink after work. The only thing the 18th Amendment accomplished was taking the 5th largest industry in the United States, stripping it away from tax-paying, law-abiding businesses, and handing it directly to criminal street gangs on a silver platter. Overnight, alcohol went from a cheap, regulated commodity to an insanely profitable, tax-free contraband item. Did people stop drinking? Not even a little bit. Instead of going to legal saloons, people started going to speakeasies, underground, secret bars hidden behind legitimate storefronts, inside basements, or down dark alleyways. To get in, you had to knock on a reinforced door, look through a tiny peephole, and whisper a password to a heavyset guy named Tony. Before Prohibition, New York City had around 15,000 legal saloons. 5 years into Prohibition, New York City had over 30,000 illegal speakeasies. There were twice as many places to buy alcohol under Prohibition as there were before the law was passed. And somebody had to supply those 30,000 speakeasies with thousands of gallons of booze every single night. Enter the bootleggers. At first, supplying illegal alcohol was a disorganized, small-time operation. people distilled cheap bathtub gin in their own homes, mixing industrial-grain alcohol with water, glycerin, and juniper oil in domestic bathtubs. Others smuggled high-quality whiskey across the border from Canada or floated ships full of Caribbean rum just outside American territorial waters in a region known as Rum Row. Small wooden boats would sneak out under the cover of dark, load up on cases of rum, and race back to the shore before the Coast Guard could spot them. Small-time street gangs in cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit quickly realized that stealing pocket watches or robbing banks was a complete waste of time. Selling illegal alcohol was liquid gold. A single truckload of smuggled Canadian whiskey could net a gang tens of thousands of dollars in profit in one night, more money than a regular working man would see in his entire lifetime. Before Prohibition, organized crime in America was fragmented. They were sloppy, violent, and broke. You had small Irish gangs, Jewish gangs, and Italian gangs, each running petty extortion rackets on their own local blocks. Prohibition changed all of that. It provided street gangs with unprecedented rivers of cash, forcing them to organize, professionalize, and scale up their operations like major corporations. And no city embraced this new corporate underworld quite like Chicago. In the early 1920s, the Chicago outfit was run by a veteran gangster named Johnny Torrio. Torrio was not a hot-headed thug. He was a cold, calculating businessman. He realized that fighting other gangs over territory was bad for business. Torrio divided Chicago into territorial grids, striking peaceful profit-sharing deals with rival Irish and Polish gangs. Working right beside Torrio as his right-hand man was a sharp 21-year-old kid from Brooklyn who had a famous scar on his left cheek. Alphonse Capone. Al Capone. Capone understood public relations better than most politicians. He dressed in $3,000 custom silk suits, wore a massive diamond ring, drove a bulletproof Cadillac, and openly gave interviews to newspapers, presenting himself as a legitimate businessman who was simply giving the public what they wanted. I am just a businessman. I give the public what the public wants. When I sell alcohol, they call it bootlegging. When my patrons serve it on silver platters on Lakeshore Drive, they call it hospitality. And how did Capone and his fellow mobsters keep the federal government from shutting them down? It was simple. They bought the government. The federal agency created to enforce prohibition, the Prohibition Bureau, was a complete joke. The agents were underpaid, poorly trained, and easily bribed. A federal prohibition agent earned roughly $30 a week. A mobster like Al Capone could walk up to an agent and hand him a $1,000 bill just to go grab a cup of coffee while a convoy of booze trucks rolled past. "Officer, here is $1,000 cash. I need you to take a nice long 30-minute walk down that block and ignore any trucks you see. I make $30 a week." What trucks? I do not see any trucks. In Chicago, Capone did not just bribe low-level officers. He bought entire police precincts, judges, city councilmen, and even the mayor himself, Big Bill Thompson. Capone essentially ran the city of Chicago as his own private corporate empire. By 1927, Capone's bootlegging network was making an estimated $100 million a year, the equivalent of over $1.5 billion today. Similar mob syndicates took over every major American city. In New York, brilliant mob strategists like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky were quietly modernizing organized crime. They realized that the old-school Italian mob bosses, the Mustache Petes, were too narrow-minded, fighting pointless blood feuds over small neighborhood streets. Luciano and Lansky brought together Italian, Irish, and Jewish gangsters, establishing a nationwide cooperative network that shared supply lines, fixed prices, and resolved territorial disputes through a board of directors known as the Commission. The modern American Mafia was born, and it was financed entirely by the United States Congress passing the 18th Amendment. You cannot make this stuff up. Of course, when you have billions of dollars in untaxed profits sitting on the table, peace never lasts forever. By the mid-1920s, rivalries over lucrative bootlegging territories exploded into horrific, blood-drenched gang wars. Chicago became a war zone. Automatic Tommy guns, the Thompson submachine gun, became the preferred weapon of mobsters. Drive-by shootings, bombings of rival speakeasies, and public executions filled the front pages of newspapers every single morning. Between 1920 and 1930, over 500 mobsters were gunned down in the streets of Chicago alone. The violence reached its absolute horrific peak on February 14, 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 4 of Al Capone's henchmen, 2 of them disguised as Chicago police officers, raided a garage on North Clark Street owned by Capone's chief rival, Irish mobster Bugs Moran. Thinking it was a routine police raid, Moran's 7 men lined up against the brick wall with their hands up. Capone's men pulled out Tommy guns and shot all 7 men in the back, pumping over 70 bullets into them before casually strolling back out to the street. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre shocked the nation. The public finally woke up to the terrifying reality. Prohibition had not eliminated crime. It had created a hyper-violent, heavily armed parallel government that ruled the streets with submachine guns. And as the body count from mob wars kept rising, the federal government in Washington, D.C. was growing increasingly frustrated. They were losing the war against bootleggers, losing billions of dollars in uncollected alcohol taxes, and looking completely foolish on the world stage. So instead of admitting that prohibition was a total failure and repealing the law, the Coolidge administration decided to double down with a strategy so dark and unethical that it sounds like a movie conspiracy theory. They decided to poison the booze. To understand how this happened, you have to realize where bootleggers were getting most of their industrial alcohol. Long before Prohibition, companies produced industrial alcohol for making paint, perfume, antifreeze, and medical supplies. To stop people from drinking industrial alcohol, the government required companies to add a small amount of unpleasant-tasting chemicals to it, a process called denaturing. When Prohibition hit, bootleggers quickly bought up millions of gallons of industrial alcohol, hired dirty chemists, and figured out how to redistill it, washing out the bad taste so they could package it as gin or whiskey and sell it in speakeasies. By 1926, the federal government realized bootleggers were successfully cleaning industrial alcohol and making millions. So Wayne Wheeler and the leaders of the Prohibition Enforcement Bureau demanded a new, lethal formula. On New Year's Day, 1927, new federal regulations went into effect. The government ordered chemical manufacturers to drastically increase the toxicity of industrial alcohol. They required that at least 10% of all industrial alcohol be made up of methyl alcohol, wood alcohol. Wood alcohol is a potent poison that destroys the optic nerve and attacks the central nervous system. They also ordered manufacturers to mix in kerosene, gasoline, benzene, chloroform, zinc, and mercury salts. The government's logic was horrifyingly simple. If we make industrial alcohol literally lethal, people will get terrified and stop drinking it. Federal officials knew that bootleggers would still steal the alcohol, and they knew bootleggers could not completely wash out the wood alcohol. They knew innocent people would drink it and die, and they did it anyway. When medical examiners warned Washington that thousands of citizens were going to die, federal officials publicly responded that drinkers were committing suicide and got what they deserved for breaking the law. The results were catastrophic. Across the country, thousands of working-class people who bought cheap drinks at local speakeasies began falling ill. Wood alcohol poisoning is a nightmare. First, you lose your eyesight as the poison destroys your optic nerves. Then, your organs shut down, you slip into a coma, and you die. Hospitals in New York, Chicago, and Detroit were completely overwhelmed with blind, dying patients. In New York City alone, 400 people died from poisoned alcohol in 1926. By 1927, that number jumped to over 700. In 1928, it topped 1,000. Over the course of Prohibition, an estimated 10,000 Americans were killed directly by government-poisoned alcohol, and another 15,000 were permanently blinded or paralyzed. Another horrific scandal broke out in the late 1920s involving a popular patent medicine called Jamaica Ginger, affectionately known on the street as Jake. Bootleggers adulterated the drink with a cheap industrial plasticizer called TOCP to bypass prohibition testing. Over 50,000 Americans who drank Jake suffered severe, irreversible nerve damage to their legs and hands. Victims developed a strange, shuffling limp where their feet dangled uselessly, a condition known across the country as the Jake Walk. For millions of ordinary Americans, prohibition was no longer a moral debate about temperance. It was a literal death trap. Then, in October 1929, the final nail was driven into prohibition's coffin. The Wall Street stock market crashed, sparking the Great Depression. Overnight, millions of Americans lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. Banks failed, factories closed, and the US government found itself completely broke. And suddenly, politicians looked at prohibition through a very different lens. Before 1929, politicians could pretend that prohibition was about morality. After 1929, all they could see was the vast fortune of tax money they were throwing away. Before prohibition, taxes on legal alcohol made up nearly 15% of all federal government revenue. Now, the government was spending millions of dollars trying to enforce an unenforceable law, while mobsters like Al Capone were pocketing billions in tax-free profits. Reopening the breweries and distilleries would instantly create hundreds of thousands of real jobs for unemployed workers and generate billions of dollars in fresh tax revenue to help rebuild the shattered economy. The public mood shifted from frustration to absolute rage. Organizations like the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, led by wealthy socialite Pauline Sabine, mobilized millions of women who realized that prohibition had not saved families. It had brought guns, mobsters, and deadly poison to their neighborhoods. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president on a platform that included a clear promise: repeal prohibition. Roosevelt won in a massive landslide. On December 5, 1933, the 21st Amendment was officially ratified, completely repealing the 18th Amendment. Prohibition was dead. At midnight, legal beer, wine, and liquor flowed across America once again. People poured into the streets, celebrating the return of legal alcohol, while tax dollars began flowing back into the federal treasury. President Roosevelt famously celebrated the end of Prohibition by relaxing in the White House and making himself his favorite cocktail, a dry martini. The noble experiment was officially over. It had lasted 13 long, chaotic years. So, what was the actual legacy of the 18th Amendment? The dry crusaders who pushed for prohibition promised it would empty the prisons, eliminate crime, boost the economy, and make America pure. Instead, the numbers tell a devastating story. During Prohibition, the serious crime rate in America surged by over 24%. Homicide rates hit record highs across every major city. The federal prison population expanded by 360%, forcing the government to build brand new federal penitentiaries like Alcatraz just to hold all the convicts. 10,000 citizens were dead from government-mandated poison. Tens of thousands were paralyzed, and the federal government lost over $11 billion in uncollected tax revenue. And worst of all, Prohibition permanently changed the landscape of American crime. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the mobsters did not pack their bags and go get regular day jobs. They took the billions of dollars in cash, the sophisticated political bribery networks, and the corporate organizational structures they had built during Prohibition and expanded into new industries. The five families of New York and the Chicago outfit ruled the American underworld for the next 50 years, operating as an untouchable shadow government, all built on the foundation laid by a single dumb law passed in 1919. It stands as one of the greatest historical warnings ever recorded. When a government tries to legislate human behavior by ignoring basic economics, it does not eliminate the vice. It simply hands the keys of society over to the monsters. If you learned something new today, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the wild, untold stories of our past. And if you think one dumb law creating the American Mafia is insane, wait until you hear about the 1100-year secret history of the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire that refused to die, fought with secret Greek fire, and blinded its own emperors. Click here to watch that video next, and I will catch you next time.